Goeiemôre julle, baie welkom by vandag se aanlyn preek. Ons sluit ons reeks af oor oorwin reëse. En vandag gaan ons oor 'n grootte praat, die reës van rassisme, of ons kan dit ook noem, die reës van etniese diskriminasie. Dis 'n reës wat ons verlede besoedel en selfs in die hede sigbaar is. Vriende, hierdie reës, is die eerste ding wat ek vir jou wil sê oor hierdie reës, is gewortel in hoogmoed. En hy word aan mekaar gehou en aangevuur deur selfverheffing en selfregverdiging. My doel is eenvoudig vanoggend. Ek vertrou dat die Here vir ons sal oortuiging gee vanoggend dat ons sy voorbeeld moet volg. Jesus se voorbeeld, eerder as 'n stensel voorbeeld van die verlede. Wat is volgens die verlede die godsdienstige reëls, die stensel wat nou aanvaarbaar is? Nee, volg Jesus se voorbeeld. Nommer 2, ek vertrou, omdat hierdie reës gegrond is in hoogmoed, dat Jesus vir ons sal nederig maak, dat ons sal nederig kom voor God, en sê, Here, ek het nodig om te groei. Ek wil meer soos U te werk gaan, as my verlede, as wat kultureel aanvaarbaar hierdie stensel vir ons sê. Vriende, jy sien, omdat Jesus Christus in ons wêreld ingekom het, hoef ons geskiedenis nie ons toekoms ook nou te bepaal nie. Jesus het in ons verlede ingekom, hy het aan die kruis gesterf, sodat ons sondigheid kan weggevat word, ons sondige natuur, en dit beïnvloed nou weer ons hede, sy gees woon nou in ons, en nou kan ons die vrug van die gees ervaar en beleef, en uitdruk na buite toe, die vrug van die gees, ons kan meer lyk soos Jesus, minder soos die ou self, en dit verander ook ons toekoms. Natuurlik is daar 'n ewige lewe vir ons wat wag, waar ons saam met alle volke oor die hele aarde God gaan prys, net gaan geniet en in die hemel gaan wees, maar dit verander ons ook in die sin van nou het ons hoop, dat ons geskiedenis bepaal nie nommer 1 ons toekoms nie, maar Jesus Christus se kruis, dit wat hy gedoen het, bepaal ons toekoms. Als omdat hy ons wêreld betree het. Jesus was nie 'n rassist nie. God is nie rassisties nie. Daar's geen rassisme in God nie. Daar's geen favoritism, sê Jakobus 2 vers 1 vir ons, in God nie. En ek het gedink daaraan, imagine of verbeel jouself, dit was nie die waarheid nie. Verbeel jouself dat God was iemand wat gediskrimineer het. Dan sou Johannes 3 vers 16 iets soos dit geklink het. Want so lief het God net die Afrikaner gehad, want so lief het God net die Duitser gehad, want so lief het God net die Wambo, net die Jood, wat ook al jy wil daarin sit gehad, sodat net hulle eendag 'n ewige lewe kan beerwe. Maar gelukkig is dit nie wat die skrif vir ons sê. Hier's wat die skrif vir ons sê, want so lief het God die wêreld gehad, dat hy sy eniggebore seun gestuur het, sodat die wat in hom glo, nie verlore sal gaan nie, maar 'n ewige lewe sal kry. Vriende, daar's geen diskriminasie in ons God nie. Hy kies, agape liefde gee, hy kies dit en hy stort dit uit op 'n wêreld, sodat die wat in hom glo, dit het alles te doen met geloof, niks te doen met ons etniese agtergrond nie verlore sal gaan nie, maar 'n ewige lewe sal beerwe. Nou, ek en jy sal goed doen om Jesus Christus se voorbeeld te volg. Maak jou Bybel oop by Johannes 4, seker my gunsteling verhaal in die Bybel, gebeurtenis in die Bybel, van Jesus met die Samaritaanse vrou by die put. Nou ek gaan net vir jou 2 baie kort goed sê oor dit vanoggend, want ek wil hê ons moet ook na 'n video kyk wat ons laasweek opgeneem het, waar ek met pastoor Christopher Chapayo en Philip Breding kan praat oor, hoe kan ons as gelowiges deel wees van die oplossing en nie die probleem wanneer dit kom by rassisme nie. Ek wil hê ons moet daar ook tyd spandeer en dan nog in ons Connect Sundays gesels met mekaar. Ons gaan kyk na Johannes 4, jy kan jou skrif oopmaak daar. Ek gaan baie kortliks aan dit raak. Meeste van ons ken daai gebeurtenisse. Dit is Jesus by die put, Samaritaanse vrou kom daar aan, die disippels is in die dorp in om kos te gaan koop. Samaritaan kom van 'n ander kultuur, ander agtergrond. Jesus is 'n Jood. En hulle het hierdie interaksie. Hulle praat 'n bietjie oor aanbidding, oor hoeveel mans sy nou regtig het en uiteindelik kom sy tot bekering. En baie mense in die dorp kom ook tot bekering. Jesus weier om te sien wat die kultuur sê. Jesus sien wat hy gemaak het, die mens, die waarde in dit. en sy bereik haar potensiaal as 'n evangelis en baie mense in die dorp kom tot bekering. Kom ons spring in hier by vers 7. Daar kom 'n vrou uit Samaria om water te skep. Jesus sê vir haar, gee vir my water om te drink. Vriende, Jesus, nommer 1, breek die wêreldstelsel van rabbies, praat nie met vrouens in die publiek nie. Nommer 2, breek hy die wêreldstelsel van Jode, wat met gemengde bloed, Samaritane, die Samaritane was Assiriërs en Jode wat ingetrou het, en volgens die Jode was hierdie bloed nou vermeng en nie suiwer nie, en hulle was slegter as honde gewees, en so nou breek Jesus nog daai stelsel en hy begin met haar praat. En hy gaan verder, hier so die stelsel dramaties breek. Een van die reëls was, moenie saam hulle eet nie, moenie van hulle eetgerei gebruik nie. Dis wat Jesus sê. Kan ek van jou eetgerei gebruik, jou skepbak gebruik om water te drink? Vers 9, die vrou se antwoord. En die Samaritaanse vrou sê vir hom, hoe is dit dat u wat 'n Jood is, van my vra om te drink, terwyl ek 'n Samaritaanse vrou is? Want die Jode het geen gemeenskap met die Samaritane, daai gemeenskap beteken nie, hulle het niks met mekaar te doen gehad nie, dit beteken hulle het nie met mekaar se eetgerei gebruik nie, hulle het dit nie gedoen nie, jy kon sien, die disippels is wel in die dorp in, om kos te gaan koop, so wanneer ons iets nodig het, sal ons bietjie met mekaar te doen hê, maar daar's 'n lyn wat ons trek, hier verby gaan ons nie, ons eet nie met mekaar se eetgerei, en Jesus breek daai stelsel. Vriende, hier is die eerste punt wat ek vir jou vanoggend wil sê. Ons het nodig om nie na die verlede te kyk nie na wat is ons geleer is kultureel aanvaarbaar, nie na 'n spul godsdienstige reëls nie, maar na Jesus te kyk. Ons het nodig om so na mense te kyk soos Jesus gedoen het. Wat sien Jesus? Hy sien wie hy gemaak het. Iemand wat hom nodig het. Iemand soos jy, iemand soos ek wat hom nodig het. Dit is wat Jesus sien. En hy engage met daai gesprek met haar. Hy sien die waarde van hierdie persoon. Hy sien die potensiaal van hierdie persoon. Hy sien wat hy haar gemaak het. 'n Evangelis van nood. En hy stuur haar natuurlik later in die dorp in. Ek en jy het nodig om so na mense te kyk soos Jesus en God na my en jou gekyk het. Die disippels kom later daar terug. Ek dink, Jesus het dit so beplan dat die disippels moet weggaan. Hulle sou net daai begin deel kon hanteer nie. Die disippels kom maar aan en hulle is verbaas, alhoewel hulle dit nie vir Jesus sê nie, hoe kan hy nou met haar praat en van uit daai kruik drink? Hulle sê dit nie, want rabbies praat mos nou nie met vrouens nie, hulle dink al hierdie goeters, want hier is hulle probleem gewees. Hulle sien die stelsels, die stelsels, die verlede, die godsdienstige, hier is die lyne wat ons getrek het, en hulle sien nie wat Jesus sien nie, potensiaal en die persoon nie. Vriende, mag ek en jy Jesus se voorbeeld volg, en nie stelsels en afdrukke en reëls en lyne sien nie, maar Jesus sien wat Jesus gemaak het, 'n persoon soos ek en jy. Nommer 2, ek wil aangaan na vers 40, toe sy kom natuurlik tot bekering, sy gaan in die dorp in, vers 40, baie mense kom tot bekering, hier is vers 40, en die tweede punt voor ons na die gesprek luister. Toe sê die Samaritane dan by hom kom, het hulle by hom aangedring om by hulle te bly, en hy het daar vir 2 dae gebly. Jy sien, hier is die beginsel wat ek sien, Jesus gee tyd, hy gee energie vir verhoudings met mense wat nie dieselfde is as hy dink nie, wat nie in sy kultuur groot geraak het nie, wat 'n Jood gee vir 'n Samaritaan tyd, vriende. Dis wat ek sien. Jesus gee energie en tyd vir hierdie. Onthou, Jesus was nie op pad Samaria toe nie. Hy was op pad Galilea toe van Judea. Dus hy was op pad, hy het gereis en hier stop hy gee tyd en energie vir 2 dae by hierdie Samaritane en baie mense kom nog verder tot bekering. Vriende, hier is die voorbeeld wat ek en jy moet volg. Ons moet tyd gee, energie gee vir gesprekke, vir tye saam met mense wat nie groot geword het soos ek en jy nie, wat kultureel anders groot geword het, etnies anders groot geword het. Hoekom? Want ek sien, dis die voorbeeld wat Jesus vir ons gelos het. Vriende, so, voor ons na die gesprek luister, hier is wat ek vanoggend vir jou wil vra. Ek wil die Here vertrou dat ons kan nederig kom na hom toe vanoggend en sê, Here, ek sien hierdie voorbeeld, ek is nie heeltemal daar nie, Here, ek sien wel, ek moet groei, net deur hierdie 2 goed wat ek sien, U het gedoen. Ek doen dit nie reël. Here, groei my. Vriende, vanoggend vertrou ek vir 'n oomblik daar waar ons is, waar Jesus ons kan kom ontmoet. En ek wil vir jou vra, as jy oop is en op 'n plek is waar jy wil groei, om meer te lyk soos Jesus se voorbeeld as die verlede stensel, wanneer dit kom by rassisme, wil ek vir jou vra om op te staan. Dit gaan vir jou nederig verg, want daar's dalk nou min mense in die Connect groep, in die Connect Sunday, maar ek wil vra dat ons in nederigheid sal operate. Dat jy sal opstaan en sê, Here, ek het nodig om te groei. Ek stel my oop vanoggend om meer te groei soos die woord lyk en nie soos die verlede stensel nie. So vriende, ek wil vra as dit jy is om te staan, net daar waar jy is. En ek wil nou saam met ons bid. En ek staan saam met jou. Ek spring nie net op nie, anders is my kop uit die kamer uit. Maar ek staan saam. Ek het nodig om te groei. Here, vanoggend kom ons in nederigheid voor U. Here, ons wil baie keer ons omstandighede verander, maar U sê ons moet verander. Here, ons wil nederig kom sê ons het nodig om te verander. Here, maak ons meer soos U. Here, veral wanneer dit kom by ander kulture, ander rasse, mag ons sien wat U geskaap het, wie U geskaap het. Mag ons die potensiaal sien, soos U dit in ons gesien het. Here, mag ons so na mense kyk. Here, skenk ons U genade en maak ons meer soos U in die naam van Jesus. Vriende, ons gaan nou na 'n gesprek kyk wat ek met Pastor Chris en Pastor Phil gehad het. Dis in Engels. As jy dit nie verstaan nie, vra vir iemand om te vertolk langs jou. En ek wil jou bemoedig om te luister na wat ons vir mekaar sê, hoe ons saam redeneer, saam gesels oor hoe kan ons deel wees van die antwoord en nie die probleem. Welcome everyone, my name is Tian. I'm having a discussion with some of my good friends today regarding how can we as Christian men, as Christians, as the church, as a fellowship of believers be part of the solution and not the problem when it comes to racism. Welcome here. On my right, I have Pastor Christopher.
Yes.
Chapeo, I think when I think of Christopher, I think of wisdom and leadership. A man, a businessman, a humble man. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Phil, Pastor Phil, we come a long way. When I think of Philip, I think a radically transformed soul. So thank you for your time, gents. The goal is to have an open discussion, raw, uncut, about racism, and also to tell our stories, hopefully to inspire other people to do the same, and growing compassion for other people. So Chris, how did you grow up?
Yeah, so thanks, Tia. And I think for me, I actually grew up in a country, Namibia, that was not the country of my parents' origin. So when I grew up, growing up in Rundu, I grew up in a place where the ethnic language is Rukwangali, but also a lot of Afrikaans people at that time. So I went to an African school. There was a school right next to our house, and grew up. And the school was multicultural in the sense that, you know, there were all sorts of people there. And yeah, my experience in terms of, you know, beginning to see the distinction and the difference, you know, from a cultural point of view, from a racial point of view, really came in, you know, when you saw how parents begin to speak to their kids about who they should play with. You know, no, you play with these kind of kids, don't play with those kind of kids. And when you notice the difference that they were making, were usually on color lines or on cultural lines, you know. But despite that, learned the language of the school, which was Afrikaans at that time, learned English as well. And then going throughout primary school and high school, I eventually came to HTS here in Windhoek. And also Afrikaans sort of environment, you know. I was in the hostel, very diverse, all sorts of kids from different backgrounds. But once again, sort of the cultural influence in the school was the Afrikaans sort of values, you know. And what I observed in high school was the tensions of boys becoming men and beginning to confront on the basis and on the grounds of their values, and also picking up a little bit the sensitivities of their parents. You know, you can see at that point, you know, boys,
down,
them becoming like their dads, so therefore
Right.
picking up on the attitudes of their dads and beginning to see those clashes, not only between white and black, but also between different kind of tribes, whether it's a Radamara, you know, and seeing those cliques being formed. And for me, at that point, it was when I got really baptized in the Holy Spirit, grade 11, and that's when I really came alive, you know, to the gospel, and really began to cross a whole lot of lines, you know, that were not necessarily restrictions from a gospel point of view. So then I get to university. I wanted to go to UCT, because my friends were there, but my sister the previous year went to Stellenbosch, so my parents were like, you are going where your big sister can keep an eye. And so when I get there, also Afrikaans University, quite a very sort of stirred up environment from a racism point of view, you know, especially also in terms of its history.
Yes.
And also picking up how, you know, many people on the campus having those sort of attitudes towards one another. You go to a restaurant or a place and you begin to see the stares. Some places are out of bounds for certain people, maybe not by a law, but you know,
You
really,
don't feel welcome.
Yeah, in terms of how comfortable they make you feel and stuff, you know.
And it's not that long ago.
Yeah, no, that's like, you know, let's say 10 years ago, right? And but at church, that was the environment at His People, Every Nation, in Stellenbosch, where you begin to create spiritual family, because your parents are back in Namibia, your sisters are back in Namibia, so the people in the church, which were predominantly white because of the demographics of Stellenbosch, you know, those become your brothers, your sisters. You go on holiday with them and all that. And then eventually in 2009, I happened to get married to a white girl in Stellenbosch. You know, so for a long time during our relationship, I really didn't want to hold hands, especially in public. And for her, it was very strange because she comes from a family where, you know, they've got a sister that's also black, and there's just no racism in that family, you know. So for me to be highly charged and sensitive about that and always observing and all, and she's like, what's wrong with you? You know, that was really an experience that wasn't the greatest. You know? And so we got married 2009, and then 2010 we moved back to Windhoek, and it's more comfortable, it's more home and all. But then being part of church and everything, still experiencing, you know, a little bit of the distinctions that people make, that no, there's big difference between this and that. You know? Yeah, so that's a little bit of the rundown, you know, in terms of my upbringing at
Thanks. I never knew there was Afrikaans school in Rundu, like a primary school. I wouldn't imagine that. But I know you did not grow up in Rundu.
I did.
So tell us about how you grew up.
Yeah, so I grew up I was obviously born in the city, so born in Gauteng. But
the Transvaal back in the day, right?
Transvaal, yeah. And then, but early on in I think I was about 7 or 8 when we then moved to a small town called Vicksburg, and that's where I spent most of my time growing up. And I actually wasn't so aware of any racist incidents or things happening in my midst. So I grew up. I grew up not being taught that everybody's equal. So I did have a bit of that in our house, and you know, learning the local language is obviously also something that I really enjoyed and was part of. Even though I can't speak it fluently, I can help myself in times of need.
What language is it?
Sesotho. So I can fairly have a decent conversation as far as I can. But then grew up going to school. I think going to school, I had most of my time at school with my white friends, but because I wasn't picked up from school. I always had to walk. My parents had a bottle store, and so we always had to walk to town. And it's not the white kids that walk to back home. It's the black kids. And so those are my companions. Those are my companions going back home. And that's where I started building my relationship with people that was not looking like me. And so that, so as it grew, and then I also think growing up through sports also built bridges for us as I was growing up. High school, the same. I think I might have been one of the guys who had fairly friends from every type of cultural background. So I had the colored friends, which even at my wedding, which my best friend was a colored, my best man. I had white friends, and then I had black friends as well. So growing up, and I think in a school that was also black and white, Afrikaans and English, I didn't have so much racist experiences in my time growing up. But what I did notice was, especially leaving school, more racist incidents. So I started noticing the guys who left were with you in class, with you in sports, you played at them, played in their houses, you slept over, they slept over, all of a sudden has formed their thoughts, they are saying different things. And I definitely am privileged in the sense of growing up in quite a diverse friendship group, and my parents never disallowed it. So I remember in primary school going to Soweto with two of my black friends, not on private transport, on public transport. So imagine that, my parents allowing me to go to Soweto with public transport with two of my black friends.
And you didn't think you were too different too?
I wasn't thinking. I was just thinking I'm another friend in the group. I can imagine my parents were probably worried. But I wasn't. So I think my growing up, I didn't have it so much, and I think sports helped, and me walking home helped. And I remember many times my colored friends, black friends slept over at my house. I slept over at their places, and that's, again, you're thinking township. You're thinking they didn't stay in the town like we did. So they stayed a bit out of town. So I didn't grow up, but I think I started noticing it more after school.
Yeah, for sure. It's more noticeable.
Yeah, and especially not in times when it goes well. Even when I started working, not in times when it goes well, but in times where there's frustration. So at times it's a bit tensioned. Then the language starts, the racism starts appearing. But when we're all good and we're enjoying each other, it's not really a big problem. But when you get into each other's personal space or in the emotional side, then that's when racism appeared. So that's.
It's interesting. For me, it was quite different. I was in primary school in Pretoria, government school, so it was all white. And I can't remember of one single black child in my primary school. Then high school, I moved to Bethlehem, which is not far from Vicksburg. And again, we had one or two classes. We had black kids in our school, but they had their different own class. Like I always remember, it was the E class or the F class, and then you have your A class, and like the straight six top students, and that's how I grew up. There was like what we saw, but for me was, when I was thinking about this, I remember as a young boy that I didn't grow up as a racist. My parents weren't racist, but it wasn't also like a reconciliation-friendly environment. Like you sort of pushed towards reconciliation and like everyone's equal. So it was neutral, I would say, which is not a good place to be. For me, I want to be on the right side of that. And I remember, like the gardener and the maid that worked in our house had their own plates. Cutlery, own little outside toilet, and that was sort of how I grew up and what I saw. And then, like for you, it was the same with me. When I got saved, I would start in my mind question that, because the Bible now speaks of something different. So why do we do this? And that's when I started questioning these things. So it's interesting how the way, especially with your story, you grew up, shaped how sort of who you are today and how you view different scenarios, and even how it influenced your friendship circle is quite interesting to hear. But thinking about, we live in a time where, looking at what's going on in the US, even South Africa, even Namibia, there's some fiercely, it's divided. What in your mind are the biggest problems when it comes to reconciliation, and what do you see out there as a problem, and how can we address that as Christians? How can we be part of the solution, not the problem at this stage?
Yeah, I think for me, people are asking questions about who they are, so the identity questions. And a lot of people tend to define themselves by the way they look, by the color of their skin, by their cultural sort of background, their tribal background. And because of that, there is so much difference in how we grow up in our background. And that means that you'll have a different frame of reference from where you're coming from. And a lot of times you're taught that you're better, you're more superior, you're smarter, you're wealthier, and all of that. Even within the same sort of color, whether it's cross tribes, cross clans, and stuff. So I think one of the biggest problems is how we define our identity. And because of that, we then begin to establish a way of relating to others as being less or being more in that frame of reference because we define them differently. We don't look at people just as human beings. We look at them through a certain lens, and even ourselves, So sometimes people tend to see themselves as inferior because of something that happened in the past that gave them a mindset about who they are that gives them that sense of, and begins to create this me against them. This we're not united. There's this battle. There's this conflict. There's this division.
Okay, what do you see as one of the problems, the areas where we can be part of the solution?
I think from a Christian perspective, what I sincerely think one of our issues is I'm not sure if it's the right word, but it's understandability. So the fact that we make effort to understand each other. So I think it really gets to a barrier. So if I frame it like this, it might be okay for me and Chris to be friends, but we will not cross the boundary of me going into his house or he coming into my space. And I think that keeps a barrier. So I don't make the extra step to say, let me understand him. And I remember Carol McKeesey, Every Nation, I think she's the director, I'm not sure, but she leads the Southern Africa campuses. But she said, someone is not truly your friend if you have not been in their house. Like then you can't truly say, hey, Pastor Chris is my friend, but I've never been to his house, never been to my house. So I think a barrier is moving from my space to your space and say, I'm going to intrude that, I'm going to go into that because I want to understand that. And I want you to understand my space. And then I'm also willing to bend on that. So I'm not trying to conform you to me, you're not trying to conform me to you, but we're trying to understand each other and the differences. So I think that's a challenge.
I remember I was working in a private school in Pretoria, quite a large school. Privileged kids. We went to Bethlehem for a school's tennis tournament, and on the way back, since I grew up in Bethlehem, partly the maid that worked in my cousin's house still lives in Bochlekom, just outside Bethlehem. So I took these privileged kids. I said, guys, you're going to take some of your pocket money and buy something for Maiki and Mukuna, is her name, Maiki Mukuna, and we'll go to their house and you're going to give it to them. And just taking these kids there was amazing. How they, like the perspective changed. Like, I remember distinctly, these young guys, grade 4, grade 5, one of the guys, little boys, he said, Coach Tian, we are so privileged. I mean, I could see literally how it touched his heart once he got into that space and experienced, he had compassion all of a sudden, now that he went there. So that's so good. For me, I think, myself and our culture, one of the problems I see is the problem of just saying, I'm not a racist, just pretending it's not there, just keeping quiet about it. I feel like this is specifically why I asked you guys to engage in this conversation with me, because I need this. I need to hear your story, and I could imagine many people need to hear stories. And thinking about Joshua 10, and this whole, where the idea came to mind, where Joshua was just defeated, or the army, they lost 36 odd guys against the Ai, and then there was another battle, and now they're winning, but 5 kings get locked up in a cave. You remember that story? And then eventually, after the battle was won, Joshua said, now go and call those kings, like the giants, like your enemies, those like the things you are scared of. Go and call them and bring them here. Now Joshua, being a symbol of Jesus, Jesus being our
Yes.
perfect Joshua.
Yes.
It's like, okay, let's bring it out. Let's face that giant. Let's start just talking about it. Let's bring it to Jesus, to the cross, and see what he does with us. So for me, one of the problems is just keeping quiet.
Yeah.
I would love us to engage more in conversations, and I would encourage everyone else to do the same.
Yes.
To maybe it's a bigger step, too big a step for you to go to someone's house,
Yes.
but maybe it's a conversation. Maybe it's a guy in a coffee shop. Just go and sit and have that conversation. That's brilliant.
Yeah.
That's brilliant. Thanks for sharing that. So in 2 Corinthians 5, obviously, we are given the ministry of reconciliation. Now my question is, how can we, as a church, as individuals, as men, be good ministers of reconciliation regarding the racial tension that we face in this country?
Yeah. You know, if you look at 2 Corinthians 5, before it gets to, he's given us the ministry of reconciliation, he goes to the fact that henceforth, looking forward, we should no longer measure any man according to the flesh. And then it says, even though we looked at Jesus even according to the flesh, and we do so no longer. And then later on, it continues to say, but if any man is in Christ, he is a new creation. The old has passed, the new has come. And then he's given us the ministry of reconciliation, you know. And so I think that one of the keys is to begin to see people through God's eyes. That is so fundamental. But before you can see people through God's eyes, you have to see yourself through
good.
God's eyes. Yeah. It starts with you first being reconciled to God. I think many times around the world we put together forums to try and bring peace between people, but these people have no peace with God. And so that being the primary principle, I'm not talking just religion, I'm talking about really having a reconciliation with the Creator, you know. And once you have that encounter with God, that it begins to change the way you look at yourself and the way that you look at other people. I think that's sort of the start, especially when it comes to reconciliation.
It's so good that you say, I'm thinking of the scripture that says, peace I leave with you.
Yeah.
I mean, we can't share that peace, we can't share that love if we don't have it.
Yeah.
And also what you said is so good. We're no longer considering people in the flesh.
Yeah.
Now what they did is they saw Jesus in the flesh.
Yes.
And what happened then, they missed Jesus.
Yeah.
They missed the Messiah because they look at the flesh.
Yes.
And I think that can happen. We could miss
the treasure.
like the image of God. We are made in His image, image of God. If we look at the flesh and not like the person who He is. So that's so good.
Yeah.
So for me, I think it's understanding the ministry of reconciliation.
Yeah.
So according to 2 Corinthians, if I understand it, or the way I'm breaking it down is saying, it gives it 3 parts. It says the ministry of reconciliation is one, it's God bringing the world back to Himself.
Yes.
Secondly, he says it's the in other words, blotting out of sin, or he's not counting their trespasses anymore against them. And then thirdly, he says the message of reconciliation is being entrusted to us now. It's us going, reconciling the world back to God, even though He did it through Christ, but we are now instruments in God's hand.
Yeah.
And then also knowing that He blots out our sins. So He blots out the things that we have done. So I think it's understanding that every Christian, if you are born again, you have been given the responsibility to see people coming back to God, knowing that their sins will be wiped out and that they need to go again with the ministry of reconciliation. So I think to truly leave an impact, or how we can use that ministry, is understanding it in that way and then going for it. Knowing that merely looking at someone's skin color is merely putting a barrier in place. But it's going further and say, look, Chris is in the image of God, first and foremost. If I address someone from another color, even from my own color, firstly, you're in the image of God. The image has been broken because of sin, but the ministry of reconciliation can reconcile that and reconcile us. So I think, to make a change is really understanding it, what it is, and God making His appeal through us.
Yeah.
It's interesting because when you speak, I think about the ministry. It's like something we do, something we've been given to do, something to obey.
Yeah.
And then I think Jesus, his example was so good. I mean, we just spoke about it earlier. John 4, woman at the well.
Yes.
Jesus went to Samaria.
Yes.
The disciples went in town. He stayed.
Yes.
And then, I mean, he was a Jew.
Yes. She was a Samaritan.
The Jews didn't normally
Mix.
go there.
Yeah.
Not even talking about mix. They didn't go there.
Yeah.
Now Jesus went there.
Yeah.
And then
Very
he
good.
engaged. He started the conversation. So I was thinking about the reconciliation, and there was the ministry that was given to us. For me,
Yes.
it's like something we need to do. We need to,
Yes.
like you said, get into that space with sensitivities, engage in conversations
Yeah.
with the aim to gain understanding.
Yes.
I mean, Jesus looked at the crowds, he looked at it,
Compassion.
and then he had compassion. I
Yeah.
mean, I think that's what happens when we have these conversations.
Yeah.
So I think Jesus was always one to break the mold, wasn't he?
Yes.
It was like this is how we do it. And what did he do? Can I drink? Can I use your cutlery? Is that not
Yeah.
actually fun?
Not a special cup.
I was just thinking, imagine like the disciples were there.
Yeah,
And then what
they
they
would
would,
have been.
I mean, maybe it was like a God sent
Yeah.
them away. They would
Yes.
like protest or something. I'm not
Yes.
sure.
Yes.
So that's awesome. What do you say?
No, I think it's exactly right. You know, if you understand, and Jesus was using the Samaritan analogy often when he talks about who is my neighbor. Love your neighbor as you love you. Who is my neighbor?
Yeah.
Right? Is it just the guys who look like me? And then he makes an illustration of the Samaritan
Again.
who are Jews that intermarried with the Syrians. So they have sort of like this racism thing between the Samaritans and the Jews. So for Jesus to implicate that the best guy in the story is this guy that nobody accepts because of their ethnic and racial issues, that is a massive picture to us to say, look, God is trying to break those barriers because that's who Jesus is. He's reaching everybody. And that should be our heart.
That should be us.
Which many times it is not. You know, we tend to go with who we are familiar with, what we're comfortable with, which is not godly. And you know, growing up many times in Namibia especially, you have this dynamic where the churches are quite divided in terms of color. You know,
course, yeah.
Even now, you go to many congregations and it's like, no, our people go there,
Yeah.
and then their people go there, and those people go there. And you want to go where you're comfortable because it's familiar, they'll sing songs in your language and all of that. But is that the kingdom of God, you know?
Speaking about the church,
Yeah.
the church, we as believers, God says in Matthew 5, we are light, we are salt, a city on a hill.
Yeah.
How can we as a church, now the body of believers, be this in this fiercely divided world?
Sure.
I think, so I want to maybe again phrase it in sections. So firstly, being white, I do believe that we have to confront racism from white men to white men. So because it's not so common that you'll see a black person reach out to a white person, but it's common to see a white person reach out to a black person. And there might be some intimidations or fears, or I don't know what may be the stereotypes around that.
Yeah.
But I think if the church will remove racism, it's because we are also the pioneers of it. Like of the thing we have, I'm a born free, I'm born in non-racism, but I definitely have a responsibility to play in my own culture to eradicate racism. So maybe that's one. I'm not, and the Ministry of Reconciliation is not given to a race. It's for everybody. But I do think we have a responsibility in that.
Yeah.
And then secondly, when it comes to the church, it might be different in your context due to the fact that you guys are majority, or what the town and what the setting looks like. But I think for a church like us in the city, it's definitely just by how we build, the image we put out there. So I think, just a random example, like Pastor Chris and I are various times in the evening service together. So I just even think the picture of us together
It says
can
something,
already
yeah.
break barriers. But if it's always the same people,
Yes.
like we can build more intentionally as churches. And it'll definitely take time, but I definitely think we can build more intentionally as churches. Yeah.
Friends, thank you so much for your time. I want to encourage you to engage in meaningful conversations with people that you don't normally engage in conversation with. Hear their stories and watch how the Lord gives you compassion for them. And then the other thing I want to challenge you with is to read some good books. There's 2 books I want to propose to you. One is Bloodlines by John Piper. It's a free book on the internet. You can get it. It's titled Bloodlines. The other one is from Pastor Roger Pierce, Better Together. You can get that at our Every Nation Publications website. But I want to encourage you to read some good books and in the meantime engage in meaningful conversation. Thank you so much for your time. Vriende, ons het nodig om in sulke gesprekke te engage met mense wat nie soos ons dink en lyk nie, maar om saam, omdat ons dieselfde God aandien, te begin gesels en stories hoor sodat ons kan verstaan. Vriende, ek wil jou bemoedig om nou in jou Connect Sunday te vertel vir iemand hoe het jy groot geraak en wat het vir jou vandag uitgestaan en hoe gaan jy iets omtrent dit doen.